I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting. Tonight is Monday, October 26th, and if we could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance at this time. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And this Committee of the Whole meeting is to continue the discussion on our budget. I would ask Clerk Spencer to call the roll, please, to establish a quorum.
Gutenkopf. Here. Pezzett. Here. Shea. Here. Leader.
Here.
Rose.
Here.
Graham.
Here.
Hipskin.
Here.
York. Absent. Nybo. Absent. Healy. Absent. Morley.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
Mulliner.
Here.
Wagner.
Here.
That's 11 present and 3 absent.
11 present, 3 absent. We do have an official quorum. As I mentioned prior to asking for the roll call vote, today's Committee of the Whole meeting is to discuss and review the 2009 City of Elmhurst Finance Task Force report, talk about our goals and objectives for next year, and basically continue discussion. As I mentioned earlier, after I see Chairman Diamond just walked in, and Chairman Levin, who represented the 24 members from the task force from the community. They spent many months and hours looking at our city's finances, which we knew were in tough positions, gave us recommendations, and so tonight we'll be continuing those discussions to talk about how we want Elmhurst to look in the next year, what services are important for us. I see we actually have a lot of representation tonight from our public works employees who work very hard on behalf of the city and are very concerned about their futures as well too. So at this point, we'd like to talk about discussion on our budget. Alderman Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would say that I find myself in substantial agreement with most of the recommendations of the Finance Task Force. But there is one area that I must strongly object to, and that has to do with the degree of the cuts proposed for public works. I believe that cutting public works rips at the living heart of our Elmhurst. Public works is the bearing wall that makes Elmhurst such a desirable place to live. If we postpone vital maintenance of our town, it will lead inevitably to sharply falling home values. For who would want to live in a town or buy into this town, a town that would be shirking its basic responsibility towards its citizens to protect their health, welfare, and safety? Shakespeare once wrote, in Julius Caesar, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Amid it, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. So it is with a city as it is with men." I don't know where the tipping point is in a city. I don't think any of us know. We only know after the fact. If we cut too much, then Elmhurst will become a shabby, unkempt, slightly disreputable place of crumbling roads and curbs and sidewalks, where fallen branches and winter snow and ice must linger because of a shortage of manpower and equipment. I can assure you of one thing, that if we cut too much from public works, then all of our citizens will soon become aware of the physical decline of our town, and we will have to bear that burden, we, here, all of us. To vote for draconian cuts and Public Works is to slash the value of our own homes. And I, for one, will not do that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Alderman Leader. And for the reference, I know we've got some charts that I'd like to pull up, and actually I'd like to also defer some discussion to City Manager Borchert, who was doing some research for a couple of the aldermen that talked about possibly looking into some of our other funding areas, revenue areas, which we might be able to tap into. I believe motor fuel was an area that Alderman Nybo asked for, and then I believe Alderman Healy was asking about possibly other capital funds, if it might be possible to solve our problems by tapping into these fund areas. The other thing we talked about in the past was borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. It's something we want to stay away from if at all possible, but I'll let City Manager Borchert go from here.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Mayor. This first slide is just a repeat of the budget schedule. Council has seen this many times, but wanted to point out that we are moving through the month of October. Actually, we're beginning to now distribute the budget worksheets to city staff. The budget is prepared by the city staff, but it's first and foremost necessary that the city manager, as budget officer, understand clearly from the city council what is the goal, primary goals, secondary objectives of next year's budget, so that the budget can be prepared to meet that goal, to hit that target. And as you know, we've got a very pivotal year relative to services and revenues as a result of the economy and the previous decisions that have relied on other sources of revenue to really fund that general fund. And frankly, for that reason, we're working as a committee of the whole as opposed to working in the Finance Committee on the tax levy. So we'll be listening closely, myself, city staff, listening to and trying to hear the consensus of the council relative to what is the target of next year's budget. Mayor DeCiani will be working on that budget goals document, which you provide input to the mayor for him to write that document, but we're kind of going through this as a committee of the whole. Next up is really the tax levy, which is the fundamental resource for financing next year's general fund budget, and it would be actually preferred if that tax levy action plan could be reached to some consensus tonight, which would allow us more than a night. You see, if we worked on that tax levy plan the next council meeting, we really don't have any time between November 2nd and November 3rd to get it into the paper accurately. We'd like to begin working on it this week, so November 3rd, next week Tuesday, we would have it all set and in the newspaper for then the public hearing to be at the last council meeting in November to set up the tax levy to be considered as you would wish, that tax levy to be considered on December 7th. Just some of the, again, reasons why the calendar is beginning to push us. I did not have time to make PowerPoint slides, but in front of the City Council at the dais are the very fresh off the press September financial reports that I would refer to just quickly relative to what Alderman Nybo had asked about last week relative to other funds of the city. And are the other funds of the city being utilized as effectively as possible to provide services and take the load off the general fund so that we don't need to deal with the general fund in any more aggressive fashion as possible? To answer Alderman Nybo's question, I believe the answer is yes. The other funds of the city are being used to the max. If you would look at the Treasurer's report, the general fund, top line operating general fund, Treasurer's report as to cash and balances at the end of September shows $4.6 million in the general fund. The Finance Committee members would work at a much more detailed level with the finance staff. Maybe they would understand. We actually would add into that general fund the claims reserve account, which is a bit restricted, under restricted $711,000, and the reserve for revenue bond of $1.7 million. You add those three up, and that's really the general fund balance. That's about $7 million. That's a lot of money, but it's still below the target. The target would be more like $9 million, and we're anticipating between now and the end of this fiscal year, the fund balance in the general fund will go down another $2 million or so. So we'll be ending the year at $5 million, which further just emphasizes what you've been hearing for a long time, that we're spending more money than is going into the general fund. We're taking money out of the bank. The city staff has, the city council has restricted some of the spending. We've had a number of positions go dark, but we're still not in a balanced position. That's the general fund. The next line is the working cash fund. The working cash fund has been used in the past, as you would recall, to finance operations. It's been taken down to nearly the bottom, $33,000. That's all that's in the working cash fund. The mayor's task force has recommended that working cash fund be put back to its targeted level of $800,000 to $1 million as soon as possible. But at the moment, there's no relief in the working cash fund. Next fund is the motor fuel tax fund. There's $8,000 in the motor fuel tax fund. We spend money on a monthly basis from the motor fuel tax fund, spending about the money that is received from the state for motor fuel tax revenues. There's no relief there. Actually, I think the task force recommendation to employ a local motor fuel tax is a very appropriate recommendation, in that it's a user fee. If you buy gas, you're using the roads. If you're using the roads, you're beating up the roads, and the people that beat up the roads ought to be helping pay for the roads. Motor fuel tax is a very clear service fee for using the service, and the city of Elmhurst's receipts on motor fuel tax funds are way down from where they used to be as a result of a lot of things in the economy. Frankly, fuel efficiency. Cars are driving maybe 30 miles per gallon as opposed to 10 or 15 miles per gallon. So they're beating up roads and paying less tax. They're still beating up the roads as they're driving over the roads. And there's more demand for road maintenance as opposed to less. Clearly a need for that service fee to stay in place. To balance the city's use of motor fuel tax revenues compared to the receipt of it, the city actually had to take 3 employees that their wages were charged to the motor fuel tax fund and redirect those charges to the general fund and one to the municipal utility fund. The municipal utility fund, you see there's a little over $7 million in fund balance there. That is what's called an enterprise fund. That is revenues that are received by the city for the purchase of water and for the use of the sewer system and the wastewater treatment plant system, and really regulated to only allow expenditures for maintenance on that utility system. There are a number of administrative employees charged to the utility fund, in that they spend a lot of time helping manage and operate the utility fund. But beyond that, it would really be inappropriate to use an enterprise fund for the general fund. The parking revenue system, there's $1.6 million in the parking system. About $900,000 $500,000 of that is targeted for a acquisition, which would reduce the fund balance significantly. Remaining fund balance is really barely able to keep up with the debt service that will be applied to the parking fund for the parking decks that are one under construction and programmed over the next several years. So really, in a nutshell, there are the operating funds that the City Council has got some oversight responsibilities on. I think my report to you would be that your direction and the city staff have led to those funds being used wherever and however possible to balance the load of expenditures to the various categories, and there really is no help in these funds relative to the general fund, with the exception of perhaps revisiting the issue of what would be an appropriate local motor fuel tax fund that would help the motor fuel tax fund and would help maintain thereby the street maintenance budget more aggressively. Next, Mayor DeCiani, after hearing from the Committee of the Whole discussion last week, and I think what Alderman Leader led off with a bit this evening relative to some of the significant revenue recommendations of the task force, but also some of the remaining, I would suggest, critical or core required cuts to service. There was a question: what would perhaps a recommendation be that would not get into critical or core cuts, but maintain some of the cuts that have been put in place? This is the task force recommendation for tax levy. Task force actually looked at a number of other iterations, two of which were developed into kind of a spreadsheet of the impact. This was a larger proposed tax that wasn't recommended by the task force. If you can read the writing, we'll put in the Thursday packet a copy. It might be a little easier to read in photocopy form. This recommendation results in the state mandated police and fire pension increases being part of a tax, and then an additional $4.6 million added to the tax bill that results in, for that average home that you asked the staff to look at, that average home would pay, I think it's $19 more in taxes for the year, but it would result in a little over $500,000 of additional revenue. And I would suggest if you would consider an additional 2 or 3 cents of motor fuel tax, that 2 or 3 cents of motor fuel tax would allow the task force recommendation in the paving program of $500,000 of cuts to not have to be cut. And I would frankly support that. City staff did identify some of the negatives associated with not doing the paving program, and I would repeat that recommendation to the City Council. I would, from a manager perspective, recommend that the paving program not be reduced, to not reduce it and not take money from Peter to pay for that. If you increase the service fee, the user fee, if you will, of a motor fuel tax, that would raise the dollars to keep the paving program in place. And this scenario of a $4.6 million increase, which is $19 per year more than the task force recommendation, I would suggest would be the middle of the swing of the pendulum. It's not as large an increase as this larger increase that was looked at, which was a $5 million property tax increase, which would allow more money to go into the bank, to allow more of the fund balance to be reestablished at a quicker basis, to allow the working cash fund to be reestablished quicker. I think a more moderate position would be this 4.6 with a motor fuel tax, which still would require a lot of the existing cuts that have been made to stay in place. Some of those cuts, like trees and sidewalks and sweeping, could be put back into the budget, which I believe the task force recommended, and most of the city council is, as I understand you saying, we need to get back to planting trees and get back to providing some of those services. That could be achieved with this more middle-of-the-road scenario. So those are, in summary fashion, some of the answers to some of the questions we heard last week, and we're here to assist in your discussion.
So, thank you, City Manager Borchers. So in plain English, for an extra $19 and a couple cent bump in over and above what the task force is already recommending in motor fuel tax, we could restore critical cuts that were already done by our previous council. We will keep almost $1 million in cuts, which came from middle management staffing cuts until this economy gets better. But our biggest concern is we want to deliver services to the taxpayer. We want to do 5 miles in the streets and not 4. We want to make sure we plant trees and have the sidewalk programs in place. So you're saying for $19 a month and a couple cent bump on the motor fuel, we can do that, correct?
That is correct. There would still be cuts that have been made, and I think as you identify your target goals for what should the budget be, city staff is going to have to work through that, put all these moving parts together for a budget relative to expenditures and to anticipated revenues. Some of the sources of revenue to the city's general fund, frankly, I'm not sure have actually bottomed out and are beginning to come up. So there still are moving parts on the revenue side. Mr. Trozine and Ms. Gaston, who's not able to be with us this evening, but Mr. Trozine is here. They have been very conservative in their revenue projections. I would be as reasonably confident as I could be, Mr. Mayor, in saying that, yes, most of the revenue adjustments then made would result in core and critical services being maintained, and in some cases like trees and sidewalks reestablished.
Okay.
Next year's budget.
And there are no magic funds that we have available that could solve this based on the analysis between last week and this week. Really no hidden dollars that we could pull from, and the motor fuel, I think, at $8,000 in the account, a far less cry than what needs to take to pave our roads and really have the direct impact that particular user fee actually has. So in addressing Alderman Nybo and Alderman Healy's concerns, can we pull out of different capital accounts? It doesn't look good to do that. And one, we don't have it to do, and two, it would further escalate the borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, which is unfortunately has kind of gone on over the last 4 years, and actually, quite frankly, over the last 9 years since 2001. So, many of us are new. Many of us are newly elected officials. I know I ran on a quality of life campaign. I didn't run an anti-tax campaign. I said, I'll keep the taxes low. And City Manager Board, do you have the chart for our tax rate again? I want to show that, and then at the end I want to show the dollar.
Yes.
Yeah. So we are almost dead last at 33rd.
This is the task force recommendation. This would be the next recommendation, and this would be the biggest recommendation.
Okay.
So this would be the city manager preferred. If I ever got a chance to pick or suggest, I would suggest this with a motor fuel tax adjustment to provide the services.
Yeah. And so we go from 33rd, which really is that last, because Oak Brook has no city tax because they have the mall. So in fairness, we're really dead last right now, being that we actually have a city tax. We go from 33rd, and in this case scenario, to reestablish some core and critical cuts that have been made by the previous administrations, we go to 29th lowest. So we are still very, very low. The task force recommendation, I believe, is going to 30 or 31, so we're going up 1 or 2 spots, and we're delivering. So I think that's important.
And I would state, I have read in newspapers and have talked to managers in DuPage County, and most cities and villages are increasing their taxes where they can. So this is a from to with nobody else changing. Many of those cities and villages will be changing as Elmhurst is changing.
Okay, very good. I also want to acknowledge, I brought it up last week, but in the papers, a lot of our labor have been getting blasted. And to staff's credit and to labor's credit, concessions have been made on increases by our public works people of almost, I believe it's roughly 2/3 of the increase. They've taken a week worth of time off, unpaid. These guys work hard. I see a friend of mine who I went to high school with. He was a runner with me at York, ran for Newton, and I said, you know, Al, what's the average guy make out there? And he goes, Pete, you know, $55,000, $57,000. You know, these guys work their tails off and don't make a ton of money. They deserve every penny that they get. In better times, when times get better, we're going to remember the cuts that you guys just took, and we do appreciate the sacrifices that you guys are making, and we want to make sure that you guys know that we are here to make this town the best it could be. And you know, there's not many guys out there, any guys out there sitting on the side of the road doing nothing. That's not Elmhurst. We get things done. We work hard, and so you guys, I do appreciate you coming out tonight and showing support for the city, because you care about it just as much as we do. So, but I think the charts tell a lot. Also, the dollar chart. Do we have that dollar chart as well?
I don't have the total taxes by the average home.
Yeah, with the average, what the city gets out of that dollar. If you don't have that handy, but if you do, it's kind of helpful, because I think it shows the consumers, the taxpayers.
It shows the average home for that middle-of-the-road recommendation.
Right. Okay. Yeah, the middle-of-the-road recommendation would be a $19 increase on a roughly $404,000 house. Again, the roughly 1,000 senior frozen homes would be taxed at a much lesser rate based on what their houses were frozen at. So for the seniors, there's a big, a much lower increase for them. And the other thing is the senior programs for transportation that were looked at being cut in this task force scenario. Those are near and dear to me. My mom is a senior. Many of us care about the seniors up here quite a bit. We want to make sure we can deliver on those senior services. So whether it's getting them to dialysis or getting them to see a relative or to the mall, we want to make sure we can deliver to them as well. They are very, very much important to us. So that's why I asked last week for $30, $40. What could we do to save these programs? And actually, it's half of what I thought it would be. It's $19. So, and with this motor fuel balance, you know, no red light cameras. We're not going to do bingo so we can make our bills. I'm going to quote Father Tony at Sunday Mass. It's time for the community to step up and realize that we're a quality town, and we're here to deliver. And so I think knowing what we know and knowing that the task force has deliberated, we've heard 24 people. I got one of my mail pieces that I sent out back from April that said I was going to do this to unite this town and go to the community for advice. We've done it. They're making good recommendations. We're going to go a little bit more just so we can make sure that we could tweak it and deliver. But I think in the end we're going to have a good product, and we're going to be able to do the right thing for the taxpayers. So, Alderman Pezza, and I'll go to Alderman Brown.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick questions regarding the motor fuel tax fund. Since I am new at this, the dollar amount seems extremely small, especially in comparison to what we pay at the pump. So I guess I have two questions. Is that typically what at this time of year would be in that fund, and what exactly has that fund been spent on to get it to this point?
Yeah, the motor fuel tax fund is limited. It's currently, they are the dollars collected by the state of Illinois in motor fuel taxes, and then collected by the state, distributed back to cities and villages based on population and fair share of that population to the state population. Elmhurst has assigned its use of motor fuel tax funds to, at times when the dollars were significant to allow for it, for construction, reconstruction of roads, and maintenance. For the last many years, the revenues have been down, and therefore Elmhurst is only assigned motor fuel tax funds for maintenance. So a lot of the maintenance operations that are provided through the Department of Public Works are paid for with motor fuel tax funds.
Thank you.
Alderman Brown.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. A few questions, one of which it's in regards to the opening statement by City Manager Borchert of really what the goal is of this discussion, and I believe was mentioned a consensus of what we would have for a tax rate. I know with the information I was just given, I have a lot of questions, and I've only looked at the first page. So I do want to dive into that a little bit, but I also want to have a question just in regards to your first slide, Mr. Borchert, of the order of events. And that would be, I think, the previous slide. That one. Thank you. So my question really is, and I know this is the typical, I'll call it, schedule that we do, at least as long as I've been an elected official. We all know at the dais that the operating budget is where we're in dire straits, more so than the capital. But as you look at the schedule, it looks like we receive, I believe, the capital information prior to the operating budget information. To cut to the chase here, my point being is, could we rearrange priorities to put the emphasis and receive the operating budget, the first thing compared to the secondary thing compared to the capital?
I'll let City Manager Borchert answer that question.
Well, you really get the capital is a small part of the operating budget. The operating budget takes the greater amount of time. You get that in March. Really begin working on that in the next couple of weeks. So the question, Alderman Brand, was could you get the operating budget sooner?
Correct. Shift priorities to focus on pulling together the operating budget. So we as a council have the additional time that I would assume we need to look at the operating budget compared to the, as you said, the subsection being the capital side of things.
Well, we could, once we understand what the objective, what the goals are, we will, from a strategic perspective, work on the bigger pieces. If there'd be, again, a strategic need to know more about that prior to the full budget delivery first week of March. But the big strategic pieces, I think I can't do a better job of providing you with than what you've already got, which is the details that the task force went through in detail. The big pieces are known and understood relative to the budgets, police budget, fire budget, what they are going to need to run on versus the revenue.
Yeah.
Let's follow up to that. So I guess I need further clarification because the task force, I assumed from my questions in the previous meeting, went all over what we predicted for 10-11 in last year's budget. Are you making the statement that the City Council should be creating goals of the budget from the task force report or from what we will get in the upcoming months being the actual proposed draft budget?
No, I'm sorry, Alderman, I misunderstood. The council that approved the budget we've got approved a budget that had a 2-year operating budget and a 5-year capital budget. So that second year out budget, which the council that approved it reviewed, that second year out is the 10-11 budget. That 10-11 budget has been flushed out with a lot of details, and as we monthly now track revenues, reported to the task force, reported to the city council, the revenues aren't keeping up with the need to keep up with the expenditures, and it's short that $6 million plus a deposit into the bank account to begin to reestablish the working cash fund and the general fund balance. So basically, the traditional level of services that the Elmhurst community has enjoyed and appreciated or requested is the 10-11 budget. We're short $6 million absent revenue enhancement. And I guess my question to the council is, staff needs to know, how do we prepare the details of the 10-11 budget, which now isn't the second year out, it's the first year out, and we'll prepare it as you so direct. If it's as the task force exactly recommends, we'll prepare a budget that will spend those dollars and put those other dollars into a fund balance as suggested. If the council wishes to adjust that, we just need to be clear about what that adjustment is. What would be the extra revenue, and what service reestablishment or service enhancements do you have in mind for that revenue? The staff will prepare that budget accordingly. So I would suggest and recommend we try to stay close to that budget activity schedule. It's worked well in the past, and I have confidence it'll work well here going forward. There's moving parts certainly all along the way, and we need to be quick and be able to adapt and react to those moving parts. But the one moving part that takes a year before it moves again is the property tax, and that's why we're focusing on that part of this calendar at this time, so that you as a council get a chance to fully vet what your requests are, your pros, your cons, your concerns, your requests and wishes, and staff gets correctly the legal notice, so that December 7th we've got the right opportunity in front of the council to approve the right tax levy. That then is the foundation revenue-wise for the 10-11 operating budget.
So, just one follow-up to that.
Real quick, I'm going to, for big picture here, we got to tell them today or tomorrow or next week if we're going to levy and what that levy is going to be, plain and simple, okay? And then on December 7th, we have to vote for that levy, or vote for something thereabouts less than what we're going to recommend. That's the big picture here. We've had this task force meet. This was a plan. We've had this schedule since we've been elected. I'm new, and I don't seem to have the confusion that you've had, and you've been up here for quite a while. So then once we get down to next year, then we actually look at the nitty-gritty and actually, but we have to have the dollars in place so that we could actually itemize our budget after the first of the year. So that's the big picture here is we have to say, hey, what do we want? And we addressed this last meeting. Our city manager has brought back many of the questions that were asked at the last meeting from both aldermen as well as myself. And again, we need to kind of come to a consensus, if at all possible, and then give direction to the city manager, board chair, and staff, as well as our city attorney, because this has to be posted in the newspaper by November 3rd. So it's key that we try and do this tonight or at the next meeting. So, Alderman Kennedy?
What about my follow-up?
You had about 3 follow-ups, Alderman Brown, and I don't see where we're going with this. That's why I'm kind of like jumping in here.
Well, thanks for letting me clarify.
Okay, thank you. Alderman Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One thing I just want to follow up with, I think what Alderman Bram's going after. What I think I'd like to see in the rest of us is on one sheet of paper, what's the changes? What are we talking about between what we talked about, or what this group talked about last year in terms of what the 10-11 budget was going to be? What are we adding back in? What are we taking out? And then therefore, what is this proposed tax increase going to be? I think that's what we got to start with, a script so we can understand, okay, are we going to do some trade-offs? What are we going to do?
Right.
But we're talking in kind of hyperbole here. We need to have, this is what it is, this is what's going in, this is what's coming out, this is the net result, and this would be the tax that we're going to levy.
Right.
And start from there, because without that, I think we're lost.
But aren't we pretty much doing it, Alderman Kennedy? We have the proposed levy of $4 million from the task force. And what we're trying to do is see, and that's roughly about a $259 increase on the average home. And what we're trying to do is see what we can do, but that's still cutting trees, sidewalks. And what we're trying to do is see what that incremental cost would be, which basically is about $19 when we actually want to restore those services. Although we're still going to keep $1 million in cuts that we've already made, but that's the big picture. And we're not beating around the bush here at all. We want to make sure that everybody's clear on that. But in the end, we have to deliver roughly that we want to pay $259 and still be without services that are core and critical, or do we want to be at $288 and deliver? That's I think.
I just think for all of us to understand what we're going to do with the tax levy, we need to understand a rough cut of what the budget's going to look like. Doesn't have to be exact. Should hit the high points, and if we have to do some movement later on in this process to hit the timeline, we do that. But let's get a feeling for where we are.
Okay. I'm going to go to Alderman Hipskin real quick.
Actually, Alderman Kennedy, just for your edification, we will. I know I've been through this a number of times, and I feel. I felt in the past the same level of, whoa, hold on, I need to get a much better grip on it. And you actually, as the levy comes, and we decide on that, we have the money, and then just because we have the money, if we decide to go half back on trees and more on, if it turns out to be a terrible winter, and we have a lot of road problems, we still have the ability to do that. So I understand where you're at, and I've been there in the past, but we still have the ability to move that around and shift that. And at no point have we ever had this is exactly what we're going to do, because sometimes we didn't know that, we were going to have a winter and run out of salt and also rip the roads up. Right. So just, I'm glad to see where you're at, because that's where you should be. But as you go through it, you'll see that we still have a lot of control over this.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that once we do a budget, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. I mean, let's be realistic. I mean, it's a point in time, and then from there, reality sets in. And you got to do what you got to do. Right.
And the levy's key, because if we don't levy by December 7th, then next year's budget's fruitless, because when you don't have the dollars to do the sidewalk programs or do the trees, or, at that point, and we're on a schedule, it's somewhat tight. So that's why it's important to look at the big picture, to have enough of a levy there so that we could work with a budget that's workable and delivers. So I appreciate the dialogue. It's good discussion. Alderman Gutenkopf?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, I'm very sympathetic with Mr. Kennedy's position, because we go through this every year, and it starts to sound like we're used car salesmen. Oh, your payment's just this much a month. Don't worry about it, honey. Don't worry about the total price of the car. We kind of need to worry about the total price of the car. I mean, we started talking about, well, it's only $19 more. Don't worry about it. Well, in fact, it goes from $258 more on a $400,000 house to $277. So now we're starting to talk, well, that's on top of what people are already paying. I think unless we've got the big picture numbers that Alderman Kennedy was talking about, it's very difficult for us to really have a true picture of how much we're raising and how much we're spending. I understand our target number. We're going to go up to $4.6 million from $4.06 million. That's a real number. We need to equate that to the spending side. The task force gave us a lot of recommendations. Each committee structured their report set differently. I found the administrative committee expense reduction summary, to be fairly clear, because I like things in table form, they gave me a percentage reduction in this report of 11.33%. They recommend, if we implement the specific cuts they identified, that we're going to reduce the administration department by slightly over 11%. I don't see a similar percentage in the other committees, so I'm finding it hard to compare apples to apples. But my suggestion is that what we need to have to understand what the impact of raising taxes on citizens is going to be, what we really need to do is to say what percentage budget reduction are we targeting overall. I trust the department heads in this city to be able to find the dollars in their own budgets. If we go back to them and say, we're cutting you 10%, go find it. The task force made some recommendations. These are guidelines that we give to you. We, as a city council, think that if you cut those positions or eliminate that service, we're going to live with it, but when we get your final budget for approval in April, these are the kinds of things we're going to be looking for, but you're going to have to cut back this percent. And my recommendation as a body to the city manager would be to say the entire city budget has to come down by a certain level in order for us to meet our budget reduction needs and to spend within the amount of tax levy that we think it's going to take. The tax levy thing, frankly, it can be a shell game. Well, we need to raise taxes by this much so that we can plug the budget numbers into that in the end. And I'm not comfortable with that. That doesn't seem to me to fit the spirit of the times. If we're really serious about reducing expenditures, and if we're serious about taking the task force's recommendations that we can survive with an 11% reduction to the administrative services of the city and a corresponding reduction to public works, although I believe those are all substantially less than 11%, then let's just do that. Let's say we need to reduce city expenditures by this much across the board. Let's leave it up to our capable department heads to figure out where in their departments they're going to need to cut, along with some guidelines from us about, well, we're comfortable cutting staff, we're not comfortable cutting staff. We're comfortable cutting senior administration salaries, we're not comfortable cutting that. That's what we need to be talking about today, and those are the kinds of guidelines that I think the city staff can use. I'm not comfortable going to them and saying, I found this budget line in your budget and I don't like it, so just take that out, will you? That's not an appropriate way for us as an administrative body to manage how the city works. I don't want to micromanage these guys. I want to set realistic spending limits. And I don't think we've started talking about that yet. So I'll be the first one to say that I think this year, the budget year that we're in, we gave the city manager a goal to come 3% under the budget number that he was provided. The reports we've been getting from him, he's been doing his best to stay under what we called last year a threshold of spending. We didn't actually cut the budget 3%. We told him to spend 3% less. I think we need to be bolder this year. I think we need to cut the budget between 5 and 10% across the board and just say, whatever our budget was in 2009, in 2010, it's going to be 10% less. And let them go at it.
Budget.
That's my recommendation, and this is a committee meeting, so I think a motion is not appropriate part of our procedure, but
Right.
that's what I think we should be talking about.
Thanks, Alderman Gutenkopf. Alderman Pezza.
Thank you. Quick question, going back to one of these pages. I noticed that there has to be a truth and taxation public hearing notice. And I'm just curious, once again, as a newcomer, is that something that has to be done every year, or is that only if we're looking to raise taxes by a certain amount?
City Manager Portrait.
My understanding is that only occurs if the increase proposed is more than 5%.
Okay, thank you. And then just a second part to that is, I echo Alderman Kennedy's request, and I think out of respect to the taxpayers, I want to say I really appreciate the task force report. I said it last time that I read it several times. It's very helpful. It's a great guide. However, I feel that the taxpayers and the people of this town elected us also to make these decisions on their behalf. Tax Force is an awesome group of people. I know many of them personally, very intelligent, well-respected people in the community. They worked hard. But I do think we, as the elected officials, do have to have input into this because we were elected by the people to do this, not the task force. So I would like to see, out of respect to the taxpayer, us as a body being able to have the input also. So I think it's important.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alderman Pezza. Alderman Morley.
I think what most of us are struggling with, and the very first time I was up here, we're trying to figure out what to tax now or what money revenue we're going to have now for a budget that's 6 months away. That part I get. But what we're faced with now that we haven't been faced with, certainly in the last 2 years I was here, or the last 15 years that I can recall, is the very large tax increase that we're looking at. But I think we're getting caught up a little bit in semantics here. What I see on the schedule tonight is us providing budget goals to the city manager and city staff. City manager and city staff need to be sensitive to the fact that, as Alderman Pezza points out, the buck stops with us. And we're going to have to make some very hard decisions. Now, if I read this correctly, we won't be voting on the actual levy until end of December. So there's a little bit of a disconnect that I think we're seeing up here. We could have the city manager prepare a budget goal that has the revenue increase that the mayor's talking about, or that's in, you know, a combination of what the mayor's talking about and what the task force is talking about. I think the reluctance, I'm certainly feeling it, and certainly I'm hearing it from some of the new people and some of the other people who are on the dais, is in no way, shape, or form is this a commitment tonight to raise these taxes. So I guess what I'm hearing, Mr. Borchert, is how do we move this process forward? Because we know it's a tight time frame. But make no mistake, I agree with Alderman Pezza, the task force had a couple of months to look at this stuff. We've had about 3 weeks. There's certainly other stuff that we want to look at. We might not necessarily, I know a lot of us don't necessarily disagree with the numbers. You know, it's one of the primary things that, Mr. Mayor, if I can point out, verify the city's financial situation by conducting an in-depth review of the budget. I think it's one of the best things the task force did, in addition to recommending what we're going to do, is verifying and validating what Mr. Borchert and Ms. Gaston have been doing for the past 15 some odd years. So I give them credit for that. But I think there's a lot of us who don't necessarily, we get the numbers, and that's probably one of the best things to get out of this task force is I agree what the numbers are. I see the deficit. We all agree what the deficit is, and we have to cut certain places, if not others. I might agree with the numbers, but I might disagree with cutting X amount of public services. I might say, grab it over here or grab it over there. I'm prepared to give Mr. Borchert direction tonight. I'm preparing a budget. The chances of me supporting the budget as he writes it up are slim until we've had an opportunity to say, I get the numbers, but cut here, add here, type of thing. So that's the way I see it. That's part of the reason why some of us up here are saying, well, this happens every year at this time, and it does. But we haven't been faced with a tax increase of this size I can't even imagine. City history, I would guess. So we're following our normal roadmap to get to the hard decisions that are going to happen in December. I guess what I'm hearing, what I'm looking for is, regardless of what we do here tonight, a little bit of flexibility, and what's the best way for staff to present that to us so that Alderman Gutenkopf's going to come up with a great idea 3 weeks from now and say, hey, I want to pull money from here, and we all agree, and I want to do this. How do we get to that point? How do we maintain that flexibility without you spinning your wheels?
City Manager Borchert.
I'm not exactly sure, but I'll try. And I think in part to Alderman Kennedy's question, and I hope maybe addressing Alderman Bram's question, I hope. The executive summary, I don't have a PowerPoint slide to click to, but the executive summary, page 6, really says, I think in 1/3 of a page, in summary fashion, the big things that are going on. And staff work closely with the task force, certainly works more closely with the city council, but we agree with this summary that at this point, the projected general fund deficit is around $6 million. The task force identified their recommendation for you is that they wish to put $726,000 at the end of next year into the bank account. So they're saying we need $6.726 million more money. They've identified revenue enhancement that adds up to 4.468, and then they identified 2.258 million in cuts. Cuts to what? Cuts to what was projected to be the services in the 10-11 budget, the traditional types of public works, police, fire, tree, a typical operating budget for the city of Elmhurst is what this is compared to. Some significant, serious revenue enhancement, but some cuts still recommended in core and critical services, 2.258. That's what I think I heard over on this side, some questions about, and from the mayor, understanding we've made as a council and as a city staff well over $1 million in cuts currently in place over traditional services. If the task force recommendation were exactly concurred in by the city council, and I had no belief that that would happen, but if that were to happen, there would need to be in next year's prep of the budget an additional $1 million to $1.2 million more cuts beyond the cuts that have been put in play. I think that does go to critical and core services. So while we're continuing to study and evaluate what could we do, I would suggest that perhaps the suggestion of a little more revenue than the task force recommends, which would be perhaps some motor fuel tax increase and perhaps $4.6 million in property tax as opposed to the task force's recommendation of 4.068, would be a stake in the ground to preserve. And I say stake in the ground. If that would be to your general approval, that would be what I would suggest we work with the attorney's office to put a notice in the newspaper for that wrong way, the truth in taxation notice, and then for the public hearing for November 16th for that amount of money. It doesn't mean, as Alderman Gutenkopf has suggested, it doesn't mean that that's going to be approved, but that would be what we hear the public hearing on and what we begin to consider and to discuss while you're continuing to discuss what are the services going to look like. You could levy as a tax up to that amount, but you can't levy more than that amount. You then, on December 7th, levy a tax. That levy is then firm. It will be collected the following summer. That following summer, that would be a clear revenue item that this council would know about, staff would count on for that significant financing of the 10-11 budget. In the meantime, all those other revenues for the 10-11 budget are worked on, some of which are controlled by the city council, many of which are not controlled by the city council, but controlled by the economy. They go up, they go down, and we'll do our best projection of what they're going to be. That'll be then projected revenue for the 10-11 budget, and based on the general thrust direction by the Council of the Services, staff will prepare, as I agree with Alderman Gutenkopf. I think the department heads and city staff are best at identifying the real important parts of the service delivery machine, make sure those get financed, and once the revenue runs out, and the revenue would run out, we still would need cuts. The cuts that would be left would be cuts that would be more internal service deliveries, nice things to have but not essential things to have, services to the citizens, services to the 50 feet in front of each homeowner's house. Those would be the critical services to be maintained in the budget. The traditional police and fire services would be, I think, traditional, and the task force recommended those stay in place. We maintain the high priority services first, and when the money runs out and we need the rest of the money to put in the bank account to add to the fund balance, we identify what those cuts are. That'd be how I would suggest a thoughtful approach would be. At least stake out the ground for the tax levy. Understand that December 7th, we're going to have to vote on it. We continue to assess other revenues, provide general direction on the priority of the services, and staff will prepare the budget and work closely with the council through the next several months.
Alderman Rose?
We do that, and I think that's generally good practice. We're setting the wall out, and we have to do that legally to say that we would not levy more than that, and that's really what we need to do. We still have maximum freedom to think about who we're going to get that money from. How are we going to get all that money? Maybe yes, maybe no. Are we going to tax up to that rate? We may not. I think there's a lot of room for thinking about differential tax rates. I don't know that anyone's done that. I think that we understand that for seniors, their property values, they're frozen and they're not going above. I think we can think a little more creatively. I have to tell you, I continue to be offended as a researcher when we keep using this mean of $400,000. I got to tell you, a lot of people in the third ward don't have homes that are worth $400,000 at this point. So it's very nice to say that. But I think that we might be able to think about a tax levy that may be have we ever thought about a tax levy that's graduated? Perhaps we want to think about those kinds of ideas at this point. I think there's a lot of ways to do this. In the end, we've got to at least get that wall out there so that we can have those kinds of discussions. I think it's a very different thing to say if you got a house that's worth $300,000 and you have a house that's worth $800,000 or $900,000. Gee, that's not a whole lot of money. It's a whole lot of money to families that are struggling. I don't know if anyone saw in the New York Times today. We got a lot more runaway kids who are running away. We're concerned about kids using heroin. These families are struggling with stuff. So I don't think it's so easy to say, oh, it's just another $300, not a problem. But I also recognize that we the city itself has needs for it to keep going. But there's other ways to do this other than this kind of traditional way that we have done. I'm for, let's get that wall out there, and then let's talk about how we're going to do that. And that makes sense to me.
Very good. Alderman
Actually,
okay.
I had my question answered.
Alderman Morley, and then Alderman Gutenkopf.
I do have I have a question for City Manager. The truth in taxation, what we're going through now, is due to what we previously established as a larger than normal increase. Is that right? So I'm a little new to this, but I want to make sure I understood, because Alderman Rose reiterated it. I want to make sure I understand this. If we say we throw out a lower tax rate, let's say tonight, we approve a general levy lower tax rate, we don't have the ability of raising it, so really what we're doing is establishing an outermost number and working down from there? Okay.
Can't go
Alderman Gutenkopf.
Actually, I have two questions. And the first, I'd like to kind of follow up on Alderman Morley's comment. Have we ever established an outer tax rate and actually taxed lower than that? Have we ever established a tax rate and said, here's our money, but we have in fact gone through the budget process and not gone to that to that number?
Relative to the general obligation bonds, actually heretofore, all of the GO bond, which finance capital projects, when that GO bond is approved, there's a tax levy sent to the county that says that the principal and interest requirements for that general obligation bond will be levied by the county. But heretofore, the city has abated that general obligation bond.
Right.
Relative to the general fund tax levy, I believe, as Alderman, I think, Bram referred to earlier, we work through typically a finance committee. The finance committee with the treasurer and the mayor work on a recommendation. In the past, that report has come to the council, and upon approval, sometimes modified by the city council, that's what's levied.
But typically, what we approve in our process at this point is the levy that people see in their property taxes. I mean, I know we're talking about a wall. Last year, we approved higher than what we ended up collecting in people's property taxes.
Yeah, last year our levy was 0, and we had to borrow to pay our pensions. We actually took out our reserves to pay our pensions. We're not going to do that no more. Not under my watch. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, what do you mean our levy was 0? We approved a number that
Well,
we
no.
needed
The
to-
increase, our increase was 0.
I'm not talking about the increase, I'm talking about the actual dollar number. My point here is that I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to scale back from whatever we end up approving. If we approve a tax levy that collects,
Oh, yeah, once the tax levy is approved and sent to the county, you do have, I think there's a last call that the county sends out in like February that says we could change it if you want. It's never been changed. But tonight, we're not approving a tax
We're not
levy.
I
approving
know
a
that,
levy.
I understand that, but we're moving toward the public hearing, and whatever this number is that we decide we need to raise, that's what we're going to do. We're not going to scale back from that. We're going to decide now. So the real question that I have is about the amount of reduction that we're going to need to look at in the city budget overall. And I tend to think in percentages, but I haven't figured this out. So the task force recommended an expense reduction of $2.258 million. What percentage of our general fund does that represent? That's only a 5% reduction in the general fund. So just so I'm clear, tonight, what we seem to be leaning toward is a roughly 5% reduction in the general fund and a property tax increase that will amount to about $4.5 million to make up that $6 million. Well, it's more than that. It's about $4.75 million between the motor fuel tax and the 4.6 that we'll get from property taxes.
The task force recommendation?
So am I correct? Then
Yes.
we're looking at a roughly 5% reduction in the city budget, and we're looking at a roughly, you've got 4.6 million plus a motor fuel tax increase in revenue.
Provide less cuts, you need more revenue. To provide yet less cuts, you need more revenue.
Alderman Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a little bit more clarity, City Manager Borg. I couldn't hear you exactly clearly enough. You're saying that we're going to try to find areas within the cuts that are recommended by the task force to not cut, as well as increase a little bit more than what the task force had recommended. Is that true?
Well, as Alderman Pez has suggested, the city council is in charge, not the task force. I agree with that.
Agreed.
So that we're looking to the city council for how much serious money can be raised. The city council, throughout the year does adjustments to lesser extent on, as an example, the parking rates, building permit fees, fees associated with tickets, ticketing, fines, all of which need to be done, all of which need to be managed, and all of which have been, and I'm sure will be in the future, but don't have the impact that the tax levy does. So we're looking at the big issues. And in that big issue fashion, the task force has recommended, as you see here, that $2.3 million be cut from next year's budget, but some serious revenues be raised. Basically, in round numbers, the task force said of the problem, they suggested about two-thirds be done by revenues and one-third on cuts. That solves that arithmetic problem. But the council needs to be comfortable with how you solve the arithmetic problem. Some of you, I'm hearing clearly, are concerned about the critical cuts and the core cuts, and I frankly support that. I believe that an additional $2.3 million in cuts, or $2.3 million in cuts from next year's budget, will be very difficult to deliver and maintain the quality of the Elmhurst community. Trees were cut this year, and we all continue to hear about how that can be. Trees are easy to replace and catch up on. A lot of these other areas of service delivery are very difficult to catch up on once they're lost, but that's all for another debate. In big numbers, to Alderman Wagner, the task force suggests solve this arithmetic problem this way, and the timing suggests, on the General Assembly's wisdom of how we have to deal with budgets, the first thing that is got to be finalized on is what is the tax levy going to be for next year. That's why it's important that we spend time on that. And I know we've never been here before, as Alderman Gutenkopf suggested. We've never done it. We very seldom had to do a 5% increase in taxation notice. City councils of the past 12 years, I don't think, have never gone even close to 5%. They've always been under 5%. So to the councils of the past credit, to last year's credit, the councils have always tried to go light on property tax, if at all possible, and use the other sources of revenue that the city of Elmhurst enjoys to the taxpayers' advantage. Now is the question, what's more important? The service delivery or the amount of the tax? I'm hearing that suggested that 2.3 is too significant in cuts, and maybe this scenario would be maybe the better one. Judgment still requires most of, or all of the cuts that have been put in place to stay in place. I would suggest that staff would probably massage those cuts and maybe move the cuts from a little area to another area to allow those cuts to be more appropriately eliminated, but will still be required as a community to be frugal, to be innovative, to be very careful with the expenditures, because there's going to be well over $1 million in cuts still necessary in the service delivery machine going out to the community. But this would allow for there to be less cuts, and on the motor fuel tax side, a kind of a direct service fee to maintain the streets with a little more flexibility for other areas of the budget. As compared to, this is the scenario, the revenue scenario that supports the executive summary and the task force. The next scenario provides, depending on how far you go with motor fuel tax, if it's a penny drives $200,000, you did from 2 pennies as recommended by the task force to 5 pennies, which would match Bolingbrook's tax, motor fuel tax, Bolingbrook, Illinois, 5 cents. You'd have $600,000 more for the paving program, and you'd have a little over $500,000 more for the general fund to allow for less cuts. And you'd still put money in the bank, but you would still need to be cutting over $1 million from what in the past had been services delivered to the community. How you deliver those services and how that budget works, you can make adjustments with that, as Alderman Kennedy has alluded to, month by direction to the city staff. Certainly you're working on that after you get the budget document. But the staff needs to know what are the big boulders to put in the program. What's the general property tax going to be? And things begin to fall into place after that. I think it's this or this. Could be more. I'm not hearing anybody saying that more. Could even go more than that. And it could be less than that.
Yeah, he did.
I think less than this would be in an entirely different community, and I fully support the task force recommendation that this is as low as they dare go in service delivery cuts.
Alderman Kennedy.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I think, kind of to summarize everything you said, we got to move forward here. And I think what we're talking about here with your number up there of 4.6 million, that's kind of your wish to Santa Claus. And what we need to go out and write the letter to Santa Claus that says right now, through the Truth in Taxation, this is what we think in a perfect world, or whatever we want to talk about, this is what we might want. And let's get that done between now and next week.
Santa Claus, but I don't think.
What's that? Okay, well, whatever. But the point is, put the hurdle out there. Let's get past this point.
Right.
And then let's start doing the heavy lifting of working on the budget and figuring out where we're going to take the cuts and where we're going to put stuff back. But we got to get this piece done. And we're wasting our time really talking about this stuff. We've got committee meetings here. We're supposed to start at 8:30. I would say we ought to tell them to go forward, pick a number, pick the 4.6, do whatever you got to do to get to the county and get that out there, and let's get to work.
And the 4.6 is not done until you would vote on it.
Sure.
December 7th, if you're ready. You could push it to December 21st. I wouldn't recommend that. I try to avoid that. I try to get it done on December 7th, but you really could postpone it to December 21st.
Well, let's go.
Well, point well taken. I'm going to go to Alderman Shea, and then I'm going to actually make a recommendation from the chair.
Well, I agree with Alderman Kennedy. Because we've used reserves for 8 years, where we should have kept those for times like these, we're in a tough spot. I would like to raise the taxes as little as possible while this is going on, while we are applying for and putting the taxation public hearing in and doing all that. I would like to see the department heads put together cuts, like the 5% up to 10% cuts. I'd like to see that, but I'd like to see also get in there senior staff pay cuts, maybe furlough days, pay reductions. When your next door neighbor is going through a second pay cut and you have another neighbor who's lost their job, we have to go and realistically cut as much as we can, no matter how much it hurts, before we pass this on to the residents of this town. We've got to remember that.
Thanks, Alderman Shea. So I think the recommendation from the council, and I'll come to Alderman Pezza, would be to let's set the wall, the 4.6, with the no abatement, and the wall's set. We've got until now on December 7th and that will go in the newspaper so people actually see this. We'll have public hearings on it, et cetera. I think the public hearing is scheduled for the 16th. We have time to get it in the newspaper. We're not working with a one-day deadline as if we push this off for another meeting. This gives staff time to get it in the paper. We are not making a final decision on this. We're not voting on this until December 7th. And the vote could come down to be less than this. But the outer wall is set. We will go ahead and notify, go through the process, have staff engage city manager, city attorney, and our finance people to go ahead and get this posted. Alderman Pezza?
Just to clarify then, the vote that would be taken
Correct.
would be to agree or disagree to have the ability to get the public hearing in place.
We're not voting.
We're not-
This is, it's this is a recommendation to staff.
Oh, you don't vote on this?
We don't vote on this. We'll vote on an actual, on approving the levy, whether it's short of this or the full of it, a full levy, on December 7th. Up until then, we will have a public hearing
Okay.
so that people can come and speak to us and
Right.
identify if they have concerns or
Okay.
any issues, et cetera. So, yeah, this is not a vote tonight.
Okay,
This is
thanks.
strictly a recommendation from the council and from the chair. Alderman Gutenkopf.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And exactly how much are we proposing to cut from the city budget if we're going to propose this tax increase? It's two things. It's cuts in the budget and a tax increase.
Right.
So I've been playing around with the numbers because if we're talking about a higher tax increase than the task force proposed, I want to know exactly how much we're talking about now in expense reductions. It's gone, that number has gone down since the task force report. So what are we talking about? So it's no longer 2.3 million.
I think I understand, if the task force recommendation here, which was 2.3 million in cuts, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, 2.3 million in cuts. If this scenario is ultimately approved, there's more property tax, and this didn't, not sure yet, we haven't talked about the motor fuel tax component, but I think it's, my simple answer to Alderman Gutenkopf's question would be, if this raised 4.068 million in property taxes and required 2.3 million in cuts, and if you, as a city council, wanted to do the other things that the city task force recommended, which was put $750,000 back in a bank, if you did those things, the only thing that would change, 4.068 becomes 4.6, say $500,000. Take $500,000 off of the 2.3 million in cuts, there still need to be $1.8 million in cuts. I would recommend that motor fuel tax be considered to reduce the 1.8 million in cuts to a lower number. And if you increase motor fuel tax to 5 cents and raise 600,000, then that 1.8 would go down to 1.2 million in cuts. About.
And I think the theory of motor fuel, you know, we had asked last week, in order to not cut core and critical of the 2.2, that would kick us down to 1 million in cuts. The motor fuel tax, which many towns actually have in place, Mr. City Manager Borch gave us a list of them, including many of our neighbors. That would tax a lot of the drivers that drive through town that are non-residents and actually have a direct impact on our roads. So we're trying to keep that residential burden to a minimum, as we all are probably aware of with this. So it's a nice combination, because I was thinking, trying to restore those core and critical cuts, sidewalks, trees, et cetera, would have been $30-40 a month. But by doing it as a combination, we're at 19 plus a smaller bump and a littler bump in motor fuel. So, well, I think the wall has been set. I think we're in a good position to look at this over the next couple of weeks, and we've got staff. We're allowing staff plenty of time to do what they have to do to get this posted. So, I'd ask for a motion to adjourn, and we can get to committee. Alderman Morley, Alderman Wagner. All in favor of adjourning? Say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? We're adjourned.